Hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful space. We have a full house, Shashi. All of you know everything about Shashi. That's why you're here. So I'm not going to give a long CV. You can Google all that. He is, as we know, MP, best-selling author of 16 books, 17 books?
Well, 19 as of this week.
19. See, it's like a ticking clock. They just keep going up, and we have more books to read. But yes, it's a privilege to be here today with him. And of course, one of the most interesting things about him is he's a wordsmith. Give him 7 tiles and a Scrabble board with no vowels, and I bet you he'll get a word.
Oh, without no vowels, that will not be.
Okay, well, lots of T's and a few O's, he'll still get a word. So let's crack on today. This is going to be a sort of desert island discs with his books, his favorite books. We've got a selection that he's chosen, and I'm going to start right at the beginning.
All right.
So we're going to go with Mahabharata. But before that, I'll just say, he was born in London and then, of course, went to a good Irish Catholic school in Bombay and Calcutta. But as he describes it, his house, there was always a prayer room. He describes very beautifully in one of his books how his father, after his bath, would every day go to this prayer room and say his prayers in Sanskrit. And that was a sort of lasting influence. Most of us, absorbed tales of Mahabharata through our Chitra Kathas and, passed it down.
Didn't exist in my time. I'm older than
How old were you when you actually read the Mahabharata?
Not terribly. Of course, I heard tales from the usual source in Indian families, the grandmother. But I think I read C. Rajagopalachari's translation when I was about 10 years old, possibly even slightly less.
Wow.
It was easy to read. He wasn't terribly demanding prose. And at the same time, the story, he does them episodically. So it's not one huge thing, it's just narratives from, and that was fascinating. So I kept reading bits and pieces here and there until at one point, relatively late in life, I've got to say, because I was 28 or 29, working at the United Nations, I picked up a book I'd had but only dipped into earlier, P. Lal's so-called transcreation of the Mahabharata, which he did as one entire novel. And what was fascinating about that was that he wrote it in a sort of very racy, lively, modern prose. And he's a scholar, but he's also a very, very good translator who actually managed to bring it very much to life. And it struck me even while reading. Gosh, this was a tale that Indians told and retold for 800 years, at least 800 years we know about. Why did we stop retelling it? Imagine if this very contemporary sounding story were to be retold today, what would it be like?
Which is
and
what you did.
The answer came back from within, why don't you try it?
Yeah.
And that's what I did.
And this was it. This was the result.
The great Indian novel.
Great Indian novel. So this was written when you were in Geneva.
That's right.
And it was the retelling. Very funnily done. We'll see how we go. I do want you to read a bit, but we'll see how we get on.
No hurry.
And
sure.
We might come back to this.
Okay.
You want to tell us a little bit about how you
About the Mahabharata itself or about the book?
No, about a little bit about your retelling.
Okay, well, the Mahabharata has a couple of things that made it particularly relevant to retell it. It is this grand epic which for about 800 years, from roughly 400 before Christ to 400 after Christ, was sort of the National Library of India. It really was, everything got shoved into it. Stories, episodes, philosophies, digressions, didactic lessons telling you to extol the Brahmins and all sorts of things. There was verse, there was the entire Bhagavad Gita, the wonderful philosophical treatise got thrown into one of the episodes of the Mahabharata. So people told and retold it and interpolated into it every tale worth telling, as it were, for that period of time. And it became this extraordinary work, which is what really made it the great Indian epic. But it was at the same time a secular epic. We had in parallel the Ramayana, which is considered a sacred epic, an epic telling the story of a god king who goes out to retrieve his abducted queen from the king of Lanka. And the entire journey, the encounters he has on the way, and the final triumph, this is something that people revere Rama is worshipped particularly for the last 1,000 years, as is many others in the story, Hanuman, the monkey god king, and Sita, the queen, and others. Whereas in the Mahabharata, the characters are all too human. They give themselves, shall we say, play for every conceivable human weakness. You've got lust and deceit and betrayal and greed and ambition and envy. Everything is there. So whereas the Ramayana is treated with a certain reverence that makes tampering with it difficult for an Indian author. There is Aubrey Menon, the half Indian, half British writer, who did that in the 50s and got banned for his pains. Rama Retold. But with a secular epic, I felt I could sort of decide to take the mickey out of it. So I actually took the epic itself and retold it as a satirical novel of India in the 20th century, from the British days to the then present. The book is now 30 years old.
So let's have the first paragraph.
Okay,
Go on.
the Mahabharata is supposed to have been composed by Ved Vyas. Now, since it was told over 800 years, no one knows whether Ved Vyas was an individual and when he actually did it. And he dictates it to our elephant-headed god, Ganapati or Ganesh. And so in my novel, a retired old politician, in his dotage and in his anecdotage, as old as the century, dictates the novel, as you will see, to a secretary called Ganesh or Ganapati, who comes in dragging his enormous trunk behind him. But this is a trunk containing his clothes, such are the secular uses of Indian divinity. But anyway, and the fact is that then every major episode in the Mahabharata and character, and even some of the philosophical digressions in it, are reinvented to tell a satirical tale of the freedom struggle, the exit of the British, and the arrival of independence, and some of the triumphs and failures of independence as well.
Sure.
So it's now a 30-year-old book. It's in its 57th edition or something quite absurd.
Incidentally,
well, you got one of the early ones.
Incidentally, I interviewed you when you wrote it.
And you interviewed me 30 years ago when I wrote it.
So we'll read the first paragraph because it's just
the first paragraph, all right. Yeah. They tell me India is an underdeveloped country. They attend seminars, appear on television, even come to see me, creasing their 800 rupee suits. I mean, that has really, inflation has struck that. That is it. And clutching their molded plastic briefcases to announce in tones of infinite understanding that India has yet to develop. Stuff and nonsense, of course. These are the kinds of fellows who couldn't tell their kundalini from a decomposing earthworm. And I don't hesitate to tell them so. I tell them they've no knowledge of history and even less of their own heritage. I tell them that they'd only read the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, study the golden ages of the Mauryas and the Guptas, and even of those Muslim chaps, the Mughals. They would realize that India is not an underdeveloped country, but a highly developed one in an advanced state of decay. They laugh at me pityingly and shift from one foot to the other, unable to conceal their impatience. And I tell them that, in fact, everything in India is overdeveloped, particularly the social structure, the bureaucracy, the political process, the financial system, the university network, and for that matter, the women. I had to apologize to that at a women's college, so I'll do it right away in anticipation. Cantankerous old man, I hear them thinking as they make their several exits. And of course, there is no party ticket for me anymore, no place for me in their legislative confabulations, not even a ceremonial governorship. I am finished, a man who lives in the past, a dog who has had his day. I shall not enter the 21st century with them. And then it goes on in that vein.
Of course.
That's the beginning of the great Indian novel. But it's the thing about the Mahabharata is precisely that it lends itself, I think, to this. And though it was obviously very irreverential, it won every book award in India in those days. There weren't too many around. And won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and it's still in print 30 years later. and people who weren't born when it first came out are coming up to me, telling me how much they love it. So I feel it's had the impact it was meant to have.
Absolutely. So you were then, of course, in the UN, and then you became this politician.
And one day I'll be cantankerous
did you?
fellow writing my memoir, dictating my memoir.
And as a politician, you wrote Why I Am a Hindu, which is partly personal, partly political as well.
Right. So it is actually precisely both those things. It's personally an inquiry into my own faith, as I have grown up with it, practiced it, observed it, and read about it. And it is also a scholarly study of Hindutva, the political doctrine ostensibly emerging from the Hindu faith, though I believe it really has very little to do with Hinduism as I understand it. And then in the final bit, it's sort of a reaction, if you like, to the. I was at the Berlin Literature Festival 2 days ago, and the moderator said it's a Hegelian work because you start off with a thesis which is Hinduism, the antithesis which is Hindutva philosophy, and at the end is this wonderful coming together of my desire to reclaim Hinduism for the kind of liberal spirit that I am here to speak for.
There's a phrase which all of us here are very familiar with, take back control. And I think was that the sort of intent in this?
Well, I'm not sure, frankly, that's an achievable objective. I mean, the honest truth is that India, in many ways, is going through an unrecognizable transformation in the last few years. And, you know, it's certainly not the India I grew up in, and arguably not even the India I came back to after 3 decades and a half abroad.
Of course.
When I returned to India and plunged myself in Indian politics a little over 10 years ago. 10.5 years ago now, I must say that it's changed dramatically. In some ways, I suppose it's a great privilege to be present at this moment and be one of the voices seeking to resist it. With what degree of success remains to be seen.
Right. So let's move on from Hinduism and let's go back to Shashi's college days, where he reclaimed the Wodehouse Society in Stephens.
That's true. At that point, the first and only Wodehouse Society in the world.
Yeah, that's amazing.
As I discovered later when the big parent Wodehouse Society established in London with some member of the royal family as one of the patrons.
Really?
And they made me a patron too, by the way. I actually remember addressing their black tie dinner in the inns of, where was it, Lincoln's Inn, I think it was, with, was it the Duke of Kent or Prince Michael? One of these chaps in attendance. It was all very impressive. But I mean, the thing is, I spoke about Wodehouse in India and how popular he was, and why it had nothing to do with colonial nostalgia, of which I possess not a shred. But in fact, the great thing about Wodehouse really was that though the English language, as it were, gave us the passport to the world of enchantments he offered us, because what he wrote about was as unreal to his English readers as they were to the Indians, you actually didn't need the visa of familiarity or allegiance to the world he was depicting. I mean, read these wonderful tales of, convoluted plots involving petty larceny by silly ass aristocrats and young men in spats. And, none of you has ever seen an England like that, if it ever existed, because Wodehouse left as a very young man and sort of almost invented this kind of England in his head. But we in India actually found this a lot of fun. There's his wonderful subversion of the English language and all the classical allusions from Shakespeare to the other classics that you're supposed to have been taught in England to venerate, and the way in which he sent them up actually fed into our subversive spirit.
It did.
And it was an awful lot of, it surprised a lot of people in this country when I wrote a piece in The Guardian some years ago pointing out that at that point, probably less true today, but at that point, Wodehouse probably had more of a following in India than in the UK.
Yeah, possibly. So one of your chosen books is Heavy Weather.
I felt
the
it was
Empress of
unfair to ask
Blandings.
me to choose a book. I'd rather choose an author. The man wrote 95.
Absolutely.
And I've read them all by the time I was 19.
So I was curious
So
why
this is
you
my
chose.
childhood enthusiasm.
Yeah, I was curious as to why you chose heavy weather. I mean, of course.
Well, I just said I had to choose a book rather than an author. So I said,
Okay.
you know, I mean, I could have chosen one of at least 20.
Of course.
But there was this particular golden period in the late 20s and early 30s when anything he wrote was just sublime. And I mean, a lot of people who haven't bought into the Wodehouse, who haven't scratched the Wodehouse itch, as it were, don't fully appreciate why he was so revered by all his contemporaries. I mean, Hilaire Belloc called him the greatest English writer ever. Somebody else called him the master. And that was the kind of language that was used. And certainly the greatest English writer since Shakespeare, I have no doubt about myself. So, you know, go out and read him if you haven't. He really, but above all, he was incredibly funny, which is what the whole thing was about.
Absolutely.
But anyway, so Heavy Weather is this absurd plot which involves a scandalous manuscript, of course written by a silly ass aristocrat, about his peccadillos, his youthful indiscretions. It involves a prize pig.
Yes.
Which, by the way, was also the logo of the Wodehouse Society.
Of the Wodehouse Society. Yes.
The prize pig known as the Empress of Blandings. 3 or 4 absent-minded earls and lords and knights. A couple of formidable aunts. And the Wodehouse had this thing about aunts bellowing at each other like mastodons across the primeval swamp, quote unquote. And there's a sleazy detective. There's a mercenary publisher. Any mercenary publishers around? there's all sorts of zany characters all trying to get their hands on this manuscript. I won't give the ending away because it's classic. But it really, the plotting is so convoluted and contrived that you just can't put the book down. I mean, I challenge anybody with, you know, who's not actually suffering from excessive drowsiness to begin a Wodehouse and not want to read it till the end.
Absolutely.
It's not the kind of book you put aside and say, I'll wake up in the morning and finish it. And so that's the joy. I mean, that's, for me, there was a lot to be said for, you know, if I had to choose one English writer, who would I choose? And I think he just represented so much about the joy that language gives in literature. And I don't think there's been a prose stylist to compare with P.G. Wodehouse in anything I've read since.
So I believe you wanted to write to P.G. Wodehouse, and you didn't, because you just...
I wrote a short story once.
you wanted to write to him, and you kept destroying
I wanted to write to Wodehouse, yes, I did.
You wanted to write to him,
yes,
and you kept destroying your drafts because you said, it's not up to scratch.
Yeah, I regret that in many ways. I think I was a nervous teenager, don't forget. Wodehouse died in 75, February, when I was not quite 19. And he, you know, every time I wrote it, I wanted to tell him about the Wodehouse Society. That was my excuse for writing to him. And I had this beautiful letterhead with a curly-tailed pig and so on, and the fact that there was all this appreciation for his work, his genius, in this far forgotten corner of the world. In Delhi, and I just felt at the same time that, you know, how can you offer, you know, bad food to Bocuse or whichever other master chef you all celebrate today? You know, you can't give them a sort of collapse souffle. So every time I wrote a draft, I said, this isn't good enough to send to Wodehouse. Tore it up, started again. And after 4 or 5 drafts, the poor man died and he never saw any of it.
But of course, your love for words probably came from there.
Absolutely.
Did you read dictionaries as a child?
No.
Were you one of those?
In fact, I was just explaining to people that I probably have opened a dictionary far less than most people. What I did was I read widely and indiscriminately. And remember, I grew up in India without television, without computers, Nintendo, PlayStation, mobile phones, or any other distractions. And on top of that, I was an asthmatic child who was up unable to breathe most nights. So what do? You read. And I read inconveniently fast. I had no older brothers or sisters, so I had to read my parents' books. That's all there was around me. If they took me to the library, I would finish the book in the car on the way home, so that was no real solution. So books were my education, my entertainment, and my escape from my own suffering. And it became, for me, therefore, a source of language as well. In the sense that if you come across an unfamiliar word in 3 books, in 3 different sentences, 3 different contexts, you will quickly understand what it means, how it's used, what the nuances are when you use it, when it's sarcastic, when it's serious, when it's straightforward, etc., without looking up a dictionary. And so, because I was an impatient and rapid reader, I didn't have the patience to look up dictionaries. I just read more books, and sometimes a word I hadn't fully understood, I think it might mean this, and then I come across it in another book, and yeah, sure, that's what it means, and then I go on.
Sure.
And that's how I came across all these words.
So you've been sending all your Twitter followers.
Well, that's just for jokes.
And you don't find these. I'm going to ask you to pronounce it because I can't even try to. So go on, tell them. Just the top two.
Oh, okay. So there's a background story to this. When I published my last book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, of course, I have a fairly decent social media following, about 7 million people on Twitter. So my publishers wanted me to publicize that the book was coming out, or pre-orders available. Now, I thought just announcing a book, I mean, authors announce books all the time, so why would it make a big difference? I thought, and I'd acquired this, I thought, unfair reputation for using difficult words. So I thought, let me use a really obscure word and thereby draw attention to the book. So I tweeted, my next book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is more than just a 400-page exercise in floxinose nihilipilification, which is actually a word I learned in college for the act of estimating as worthless. It is a legitimate word. It simply means to say something is worthless is called floxinose nihilipilification. And since the book was about a prime minister whom I was obviously opposed to, I assumed that people would think I was simply going to call him worthless. I said, no, it's much more than that, read it. And certainly orders for the book went up, and the spike for searches of floxinose nihilipilification went up too. So,
well, go for a few.
So then when there was the inevitable backchat on social media, I suggested to people that they really shouldn't have this hippopotamonstrous sesquipedalophobia, which means the unnecessary fear of long words.
So the Times of India actually did a piece giving the 10 words that Shashi teaches us every day, which is
silly.
Hilarious. So we move on to your next choice, and let's go to 100 Years of Solitude. Slight change from Wodehouse. What made you choose that?
Well, my then wife, whom you know, Minu, and I used to live in Geneva and come to England just to get English language books. There wasn't an English language bookstore in Geneva in those days, and I was working for the UN. So when we got time off, we'd actually drive here and then head for Foyles, and the inevitable story of Foyles and Dillon's and so on, and just go back with cartloads or carloads, literally, of books. And we stumbled across Garcia Marquez in one of these bookshops. He wasn't famous yet. I mean, he was famous in Latin America, and for Spanish language readers, he'd been translated a few years later into English. He hadn't yet won any of the major prizes. We picked up the 100 Years Solitude, absolutely enthralled. I never had a desire to write magic realism, but it opened my eyes. And what 100 Years of Solitude does is, in many ways, it expands the realm of the possible, of what you can do with fiction, how you can introduce an element through the narration of an experience, not just a story. Stories are marvelous too, but the experience that is being lived by the characters through a subtle stretching of human perception. You call that magic realism because things happen that rationality tells you cannot have happened in real life to real people. But they are depicted in such a way that they actually seem to relate to entirely plausible events. You get drawn in to the subtle logic of that author and his creation in such a way that you're transported along. It's an absolutely enthralling work. I mean, I turned the last page and said, I have just read one of the greatest books I will ever read, and perhaps one of the greatest books ever written. Absolutely. And obviously, we then read everything we could by him in translation in English, and I'm proud to say I've read pretty much everything he's written. I think his peak period really was the late 60s and the 70s, and there was some decline or some self-indulgence when he'd become really famous and won the Nobel and was a grand old patriarch. So I think he became a little more, a little less exacting of himself. And that happens to all good writers. I mean, I think the other magic realist I could have chosen would have been Salman Rushdie, who in many ways I would say
He's very influenced by
did the same
Marquez,
sort of thing with Midnight's Children that Garcia Marquez had done for Colombia. But instead I chose in the list a Malayalam novelist.
Yes, I was just
who
coming
was
to that.
actually writing his work of magic realism at exactly the same time Garcia Marquez was writing his. He was writing in Malayalam, Garcia Marquez was writing in Spanish. Garcia Marquez became world famous. O.V. Vijayan never did, but O.V. Vijayan's work to Malayali readers is just absolutely epic. Now,
So
the
this is
problem with the English translation.
This is the book that Shashi's chosen. Sorry to interrupt. It's O.P. Vijayan's The Legends of Khasak. And I hadn't read it, so thank you for introducing me to him.
Well, the irony is that there's a huge controversy about the English version because O.V. Vijayan wrote The Legends of Khasak in the mid-60s. It was published, it was actually Khasakan Itihasam, which means a history of Khasak, strictly speaking in Malayalam. It was published in 1969, about the same time
as
2 years
Marquez,
after Garcia Marquez, but it had been written really, in parallel practically. So I would say they're both inventors of magical realism. But the translation was much later. And it was done by himself in the meantime, because unfortunately, writing, particularly writing fiction, makes you no money in India, unless you write potboilers, and there are a few young men who've done very well out of that. But writing literary fiction makes you no money. He actually made his living, believe it or not, as a political cartoonist for Indian newspapers. And he was quite a brilliant political cartoonist. But O.V. Vijayan never achieved the kind of literary renown, precisely because he wasn't in an internationally recognized milieu as Garcia Marquez was. And then in '94, he did the English translation himself. Now, he writes very well, so his English is fine. There's no problem with the translation. But what's striking about the book is it's subtly different in many ways. And what literary scholars say is that the Malayalam original is written by a young man grappling with incertitudes. Somebody who's basically atheistic, troubled, looking for his own political moorings in life, questioning everything, questioning tradition, questioning history, questioning politics, questioning social conventions. And so the book is suffused with the sense of a quest that is absent in the later translation, 25 years later, by an older man who believes he's found his certitudes. And it's very interesting that a translation can be accused of betraying the original when the translator is the original writer himself. But I mean, I think the world awaits perhaps a truer translation of the original to show you all the magic of what he did. I mean, it is such a seminal work in Malayalam literature that many critics speak of Malayalam fiction as before Khasak and after Khasak. Khasak was such a dramatic event. A young man going in the date's unclear, but roughly the 50s, it's post-independence, but early years after independence, to an obscure village where there is no school, and he is asked by the government to set up a one-teacher school. And his experiences, his relationship with this woman, which goes wrong, his own social challenges, etc., and all very keenly observed, because Vijayan's own sister had been in that situation. And he'd lost his job at the same time as a journalist, so he'd gone there and observed this village and met people and so on. And it's an unforgettable work and rather well done, but until somebody translates the original authentically, this is still a very, very interesting book to read. And it shows you how significant.
Yeah, sorry. It captures Kerala so well, the Hindu, Muslim, Christian aspects all sort of, and told very magically without any sermons, which is beautiful.
That's right, and the thing is that that's Kerala, and that's in many ways, for me, the ideal of how India should be. A place where people of all religious backgrounds coexist, cooperate, live the same life, dream the same dreams. and share the same experiences. So that certainly endears the writer to me as well.
Sure.
There's one more fact. He was a classmate of my father's. And in his very, very old age, I went to meet him with my father and had some very interesting conversations. And I had the great privilege in his very last year of life I happened to be in the jury of the Berlin Lit Fest, so I recommended that they invite him.
Okay.
And they were not a terribly well-financed festival in those days, but he was unable to move on his own, so his wife went as his nurse, and he spoke there and made a terrific impact, and within a few months he passed away.
Oh.
Just a fine human being and a great writer.
Fabulous. Oh, it's nice to know. So moving on, so in 2007, you stood for elections in the United Nations to be Secretary General. You lost. That was terrible for you. But you moved on. You decided, come back to India, come back to Kerala, Vijayan's Kerala and your Kerala, and join politics. So tell us about that. And what were the influences? You've written these books on Nehru, and you've chosen Discovery of India. So tell us, how much of an influence Nehru was, and tell us about Discovery.
Profound influence, because he really was one of the most remarkable minds on the global political stage in the 20th century. And I say this with absolutely no exaggeration. I think it's a great pity that people have forgotten Nehru to the extent they have, because in his lifetime, he wasn't just this, visionary nationalist and effective democratic politician who stood up to the Brits and eventually became, for 17 years, the first Prime Minister of independent India. He was also a brilliant writer. Every single one of his books has been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, including his autobiography, written 6 years before he even became Prime Minister. So his life was interesting enough before that point. His glimpses of world history, which is letters essentially to his daughter from jail, without the benefit of any reference books, is a magisterial evocation of the history of the world from a slightly Fabian socialist perspective, but told with tremendous verve and confidence and command of material. Just an extraordinary mind. And the Discovery of India, which was published, it was largely written in jail during the Second World War, when the Brits had jailed all the Indian nationalist leaders. Again, no reference material readily available, but fellow prisoners all had insights to offer him. Yeah. And they talked to each other, and they came up with nuggets that he gleaned about different aspects of Indian life and history. And it's it's a magisterial work, because it's a book about philosophy, about history, about society, about culture, and about politics, and about India's yearning for independence from British rule. And it's written in, today perhaps slightly old-fashioned sounding, but certainly to my mind mellifluous prose, really highly readable prose. Yeah. And published in 1946, ironically first published in America before it could find a British publisher. John Day, I think, was the American publisher. And The Discovery of India remains a classic. It's very much still in print. Penguin has brought out a handsome edition in India a couple of years ago. And it's really a remarkable work by a remarkable mind. Very readable, very insightful. And it helped in many ways shape for me the kind of beliefs and values about India that I have not just cherished, but which have animated my own writing. So if I had to think of a political leader who'd inspired me, not just by his political actions and deeds, but by his thoughts, his ideas, and his writing, it would be Nehru. I mean, I imbibed from Nehru, for example, my utter faith in Indian pluralism, which he called secularism, which I think was actually not the right word. He himself was very much a rational-minded atheist sort of person, which I'm not. And so he was comfortable with the use of the word secular, which, as you know from your dictionaries, involves a distancing from religion and an absence of religion in public life, but which in India has been interpreted to mean the opposite. Secularism in India actually means pluralism. It means a proliferation of religions, all of which in various ways are encouraged by the state. So whereas a secular French law prohibits anyone from walking into a government office or even attending a government school with any visible sign of faith. No yarmulke, no turban, no crucifix, nothing. In India, you see all of those in every government office and every school, and you take it for granted that everyone can be who they are. That's the sort of difference between our version of secularism and the West's. But this faith that in India all religions belong, have equal rights, can make an equal contribution, and have in the past made such a contribution. That idea has not been more brilliantly and more seminally argued than by Nehru.
Yep. So you wrote his biography as well, obviously. Yeah. And was that a reason was Nehru and the philosophy of the Congress Party one of the major reasons you wanted to join the Congress Party?
Well, yes and no. I wasn't totally uncritical of Nehru as Prime Minister. I did think that some of his economic policies and particularly his economic policies had become a bit out of date. The book is not a hagiography.
No, it's not.
And I'm hoping it will be out again in the UK soon. It's now 15 years ago, but when it was reissued by Penguin in India in a new hardback edition with a new introduction, they didn't have to change a word in the text. It stood up very well. It's the story of Nehru with, and I hope it reads as an enjoyable narrative, and it's also some of the lessons of his life and his legacy that are distilled from it. And it has the great merit of brevity, because every other biography of Nehru that's worth reading is at least 600 pages or 7 volumes and counting. So mine has pretty much, I think, all the essential things that a modern reader ought to know about one of the great political minds of the 20th century in just about 200 odd pages, and it's crisp and readable.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually bring up one of the issues, which is, of course, now raging in India, and you know what it is. It's Kashmir. And you were quite critical. I was quite interested to read this line that you wrote about Nehru when, you know, after the invasion, and then he goes, and you say that Mountbatten asked him to go to the UN, which is, all of you know the background, we're not going into that. But you say here that, but Nehru should hardly, and you say that the pressure from the West made him do that, and you're right. But Nehru should hardly have been surprised to see other countries acting in pursuance of their own interests. The wonder was that a man of such sharp intelligence and insight should have failed to more clearly define and act upon India's. Just wanted to hear what you thought.
Well, that was not written by the Congress politician, obviously.
Of course. Oh, no, but, you know, you have always spoken out, even as a Congress politician.
Yeah, I mean, so you know...
now that it's raging,
great
Kashmir...
men make mistakes, and some of them are great mistakes. Yeah. And I think that when one looks back on some of the choices, you can understand the choices always in context. And, you know, I'm presumptuous enough to feel a certain empathy with Nehru, because I find his mind is so much like perhaps what I've tried to train my mind to be, that I can imagine why he took some of the decisions he took. Though I wouldn't make those decisions myself today, because I've grown up in a different time, and perhaps because not being under the heat of that moment, I can see those decisions more objectively. But that's the great challenge always in interpreting the past, is understanding why people did what they did in the context of the times and the pressures under which they were doing them. And that's something we don't, I think, particularly retrospective history never does enough of.
Sure.
We don't really try enough. I think, for example, on China, I think Nehru sort of deluded himself. And he also deluded himself about the extent of Indian defense preparedness, because he and his government had systematically undermined the Indian army because of their resentment of the army as an imperial institution in the British days. And remember, that entire generation of army personnel, officers he was dealing with, had all served the British Indian army. So there was always a certain resentment there. He kept cutting them down in the protocol system, reducing the defense budget year after year throughout the 1950s. So when things went or began to go really wrong with China, he ordered an unprepared and unready army, under-equipped, to do something that it simply was not equipped to do anymore. These fellows had World War II vintage, Lee and Enfield rifles. They had canvas shoes to walk into the snows of the Himalayas as the well-trained and well-equipped Chinese came down upon them. So that's wrong. Now you can see why he took the decisions he took when he took them, But the net result was still humiliating in terms of India's national interest.
Sure.
As for Kashmir, what happened was that I think Nehru went to the UN protesting Pakistani aggression, expecting that the international community would agree with him, because there's no question the state had legally acceded to India and Pakistan had marched in to sovereign territory of another country. Therefore, this is what the UN was there to object to. But the US and America, I mean the US and UK, particularly the UK, had a different agenda. And they, the UK has made no bones about the fact that in those days, part of the logic of creating a Pakistan was precisely the fear that the Congress-led Indians would be more inclined towards the Soviets in the emerging Cold War, and they needed a pro-Western buffer with access to the Gulf and to the Arabian Sea, and therefore they worked behind the scenes to support the Pakistani position on Kashmir, and so it escalated into a dispute out there. Whereas in India, we had gone rather self-righteously expecting that the Pakistanis would be rebuffed or condemned. And suddenly we found the UN coming down even-handed on an issue where we felt we were both morally and legally in the right. Nehru then called for a plebiscite, and which in 1947, 48, 49, 50, India would have won hands down. The people of Kashmir had A, no sympathy for Pakistan, B, had been aggressed and there was rape and pillage and loot by the Pakistani invaders, and C, were very, very supportive of Sheikh Abdullah, the nationalist hero and leader, who was pro-India and not pro-Pakistan. So at the time the UN passed a resolution offering a plebiscite, India embraced it because it wanted a plebiscite. But the first requirement of that resolution was that Pakistan should withdraw. And Pakistan, knowing full well they would lose, did not withdraw. And then the resolution became infructuous. Now, could Nehru at that point have gone back to the UN saying, now that the Pakistanis are not doing their part, we hereby declare this resolution null and void, and we have now just decided to absorb the state and move on. He didn't do that, and that, with hindsight, looks like perhaps an insufficient attention to our national interest in that context at that time. Those are the kinds of issues that one can look at. But the kind of demonization of Nehru that the present ruling party is doing is preposterous and is ahistorical and is also profoundly churlish.
So one of the things that Nehru is very clear about is that he says there must always be a strong opposition.
Sure.
And where is the opposition failing in India? Why are we not holding?
Well, we are doing our best. I mean, some of us certainly feel strongly we're doing our best.
Yes.
Some
but
of us are
generally,
paying
a
price for our opposition, because the government does not hesitate to use every instrument at its disposal, including courts and cases and manufactured accusations, in order to discredit and even worse, arrest and imprison some of us. So it's not been an easy time to be in the opposition, because, I was just saying to somebody else today, I used to frequently in my conversations with Indian audiences, particularly university students, and so the great beauty of our democracy, I would say, is that you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. A simple proposition. But for the first time, we have a government that is changing the ground rules, or is ignoring the ground rules established in our political democracy for 70 years. And that's becoming a real challenge.
So we are having the same here.
Welcome to the club.
But here, the difference is, this is what I see, is a lot of, everyone's going to court, so there's so many legal cases going on, and the opposition
that happens in India too, believe me. There are plenty of cases in the Supreme Court against the government.
The opposition here is probably a little more, I don't know, putting a little more pressure.
Well, numerically, you are certainly stronger too, because this is a government with a narrow majority. We have a government with a crushing majority.
Sure.
They have 303 seats, and they have allies worth another 30 or 40 more. And that obviously puts us, we are 52 members of parliament of the Congress party. It puts us in a difficult position. And the truth is that, as I wrote in a recent column that was syndicated around the world, perhaps the roots of our democracy were shallower than we allowed ourselves to imagine. Because even though this government is in many ways conducting itself autocratically, it remains very popular. And there's no doubting that.
So which brings me to your last non-fiction book, which is Arthashastra. if you don't know what it is, it's the Indian. Well, I'll let Shashi explain what the Arthashastra
The
is.
Arthashastra is this absolutely extraordinary Sanskrit work composed, in some accounts, in the 4th century BC, around 320 by the sort of advisor on statecraft of Chandragupta Maurya, the first big Indian emperor in the north. Some others say it's a bit later, it's maybe 1st century or 2nd century BC. And some date it as late as the 3rd century AD, or BCE as they call it now, after Christ. Whichever it was, it's pretty ancient. It's at least around 2,000 years old. And it is the most magnificent, brilliant exposition of statecraft you could hope to read. Machiavelli looks like a kindergarten student in face with this author. But whereas Machiavelli's is all about power, and the indulgence of various kinds of chicanery to attain and retain power, the Arthashastra is a much more humane work. It does have some of these principles of statecraft. There's a magnificent section, for example, on how to use spies. But it also talks about good governance in terms the UN would be proud to own up to today. It talks about justice. It talks about the justification for a government's rule always to be the well-being, the welfare of the people it's ruling. And it has very specific detailed prescriptions. For example, something which the Brits, to their cost and ours, ignored when they came to take over India, was that 2,000 years ago, the prescription was, when there is a drought, do not let there be a famine, reduce or abolish your taxes, attend to the welfare of the victims of the peasantry, and so on. We had the misfortune of being ruled by Brits in a period when the Brits believed that idleness, that charity only encouraged idleness, that both charity and idleness were bad, and that if taxes had to be paid, they had to be paid even by starving people. And so we had 35 million people dying unnecessarily in British-created famines, which hadn't happened before the British came, because the culture of statecraft that comes down from the Arthashastra 2,000 years ago would not have allowed starving people to starve to death. So this is the kind of thing in the book as well. But it's got a lot that would seem to you to echo Machiavelli or to anticipate Machiavelli, including principles of how your neighbor's enemy is your friend and things like that, which is quite familiar, I'm sure, to those of you who've read The Prince. It goes beyond The Prince in things like how to choose a good minister, literally how you interview people for various official positions. It talks about human integrity and says, you know, you can hire people who are lacking certain kinds of integrity, but somebody who seems likely to be corrupt, do not put him in charge of finances, or, you know, somebody who has other quality. Anyway, you should read it. I don't want to paraphrase too simplistically, because it's a very sophisticated text. And it's quite amusing to read about spying, because it has an entire section, for example, on the employment of femme fatales and how to undermine a neighboring king. You need to send these alluring, beautiful, and young women to seduce members of the king's court, the ruling council of that king. And specific techniques are suggested, such as how to make one person believe that you are in love with him, but are being summoned by another, so that he will then be jealous of the other, and the two will be divided. This kind of stuff, unbelievable stuff is there. So it's not all, you know, justice and kindness and good governance. It's also some very, very detailed principles of ruthless statecraft as well. It's an extraordinary work. And the Arthashastra, Artha actually is material success, but the loose title is The Art of Politics. Hindus are enjoined 4 purusharthas, the pursuit of 4 things in life. There's dharma, which is everything: religion, righteous conduct, faith, everything by which we should live. There is artha, the pursuit of material success, wealth, position in society, status. There's kama, which is love, desire, sex. And there's moksha, which is ultimately salvation, liberation from the bondage of this earth into the next life. And these 4 are what every Hindu is enjoined to pursue in his life in appropriate balance and moderation. So the Artha Shastra is only about the pursuit of Artha, about politics, statecraft, economic and material well-being, position and status. So it's a fascinating realist work, and it's 2,000 years old. Well worth reading. There's a number of translations which differ in many ways from each other, but I think the Penguin one, which is available in this country, is worth going into. Arthasastra, Artha Shastra. So since I was asked to talk to Shavani about books that have shaped my own thinking, there's a lot in the Artha Shastra that I find very impressive. Not that all of it is impressive. I believe I haven't unleashed any femme fatale, and nor have I interviewed too many ministers. But I will say that the notions of good governance, the notions of social justice, the basic purpose of a king being the well-being of the people he rules, these are ideas that are profound, that are well explicated, and that really do sink in, even to contemporary political sensibility.
Shashi, you've been through a lot in your, political life, personal life. Your personal life has been discussed threadbare in the media, which is all very painful. Is there, when you want to retreat from this madness, is there a book that you pick up and dive into? Or is it music? I mean, what is it?
The problem is there are so many books pending to be read amongst recently published books that I think the indulgence of going back to a favorite book is not something I can allow myself the time for. Nowadays, I'm in the rather invidious position that the only time I'm forced to carve out time to read is when someone asks me to review a book. So then I feel, because I don't review books I haven't read, so I actually sit down and go through the blessed thing. And that forces me to read and forces me to make time for it. Otherwise, I have so many deadlines of my own that if I actually did have the time, I'd go back to the computer and write.
Sure. So we, I have to open it up for questions soon.
Sure,
but
with pleasure.
If, going back to the desert island theme, if you were a castaway on a desert island and you were allowed one book, which one would it be?
It would have to be the Mahabharata, simply because it's endless possibilities.
Stories.
I mean, an unabridged thing would be enormous. In fact, I don't mean to laugh at this, it's really a cruel thing to say, but the one person who tried an unabridged translation was a Chicago Sanskritist professor called J.A.B. Van Butenen. And the poor chap started in his 20s or 30s translating the Mahabharata. And when he was about 2/3 of the way through, 23 volumes later or whatever, he died. So the work is still it's not easy. I mean, Professor P. Lal also decided to, in addition to his one-volume transcreation, he also decided to, but he very sensibly said, I'll translate bits, because there are 18 books of the Mahabharata. So he took one book and translated it as a volume.
Right.
He did the Bhagavad Gita, which is not even a full book, as a volume, etc. And he too died before he could finish everything. So getting a full translation, some of the longer translation was a woman called Kamala Subramaniam, whose translation is the longest I've read. And I still don't know how full it is, because the Mahabharata is 5 times the length of the Bible, by the way, for those of you good Christians here, just to get a sense of how long the original is. So if one actually had a totally unabridged Mahabharata, with everything, all the philosophical digressions and all the stories, because the shorter translations, the one that I recommended to you by P. Lal or any others, or you could even read the amazing script by Jean-Claude Carrière for Peter Brook's Mahabharata, which was an 8-hour theatrical production. But the script is available. I picked it up in Charing Cross Road, I think, at a second-hand bookshop. It's fascinating, and it will not take you 8 hours to read. But all of those, and my book, The Great Indian Novel, they all focus on the so-called essential story, which is the story of the great rivalry between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, culminating in the Battle of Kurukshetra and afterwards. And that tends to be the way the story is often told. But the unabridged Mahabharata contains so many digressions because of all the retellings that it would really keep you very busy on a desert island until the rescue happens.
Right. So with that, we'll take questions. If you keep your questions brief, please,
There's a
because
hand in the
we've
back
got.
right there.
Let's start from there, from the back. Yeah, the gentleman there with the glasses. Yeah.
So mic coming to you, I believe.
And questions, no statements, please, and brief.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor.
Hi.
My name is Yash, and I hail from Allahabad, which
Okay.
is the birthplace of Pandit Nehru.
Right.
I personally am a big fan of Pandit Nehru, and I just want to ask, basically say one thing, that your book is very important in this time of rising Hindutva, which is, a wrong version of Hinduism. But I personally don't blame the BJP for this. I actually blame the Congress, because I support the Congress, definitely, but I feel that the people of India voted for the BJP because they were very fed up of the corruption happening under the Congress and the fact of the nepotism that exists in the Congress party towards the Gandhi family. So my question is, and I'm sure Pandit Nehru would have wanted this as well, because I've read his history. I live near Anand Bhavan. Sorry, my question is that when will we see a deserving politician like Dr. Shashi Tharoor actually lead the Congress in this time and actually lead our country, because people do not want the status quo and that it's black and white. I don't understand why no one sees it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Look, I mean, quite apart from your mentioning my name in that context, let me just say that there's very little doubt that the Congress Party, like many other political parties, the Samajwadi Party, the DMK Party, the Shiv Sena Party, and so on in India, all tend to be dominated by a particular family, or as some people call it, a dynasty. Largely because in the case of today's Congress, the DNA of the Congress Party as it exists today is inextricably linked with the DNA of the Gandhi family, Gandhi-Nehru family. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, when I came into Indian politics, it simply was the reality of Indian politics. And having come into it, for me, politics has never been a lifelong career. I didn't come into it because that's all I was doing. I had a full career at the United Nations and a double career as a writer. But in order to make a difference in my own country, I felt that politics was the right path, and right path to advance a certain rather coherent set of ideas for which I would consider, broadly speaking, liberal ideas for the political and social progress of my country. And the one party that largely shared that vision and also had a national footprint was the Congress. So I went to the Congress. Going to the Congress meant accepting the reality of the Congress as it is, not as one might wish it to be. And as it is very much a party which, as we saw very recently when Rahul Gandhi stepped down from the presidency, and the working committee of the party could not do any better than go back to his mother, who had relinquished the position a year and a half earlier, and ask her to take over again on an interim basis. That shows that the party does feel a very strong tug of unity behind allegiance to that one family. Now, when I say the party, I mean the party's full-time professional workers. And that's the reality. In all fairness, it should be said that despite this, the last two Congress prime ministers who ruled India for a total of 15 years were not members of the Gandhi family. There was Narasimha Rao from 91 to 96 and Manmohan Singh from 2004 to 14. So it's not axiomatic that their leadership of the party necessarily translates into monopolizing the top positions in government. And certainly I would argue even today that the bench strength of the Congress, the quality, administrative experience, intellectual skill, and sheer competence available in the ranks of the Congress party, even after 6 years of the BJP being in power, vastly outstrips what's on the treasury benches. And that's, I think, still a very great strength of the Congress party.
Right, we'll take a question from here. The mic is here. Could you pass it down to this? Is it lady here? Yep, there's a lady there. Yep. Then we go this
Mr.
side.
Tharoor,
After that, we'll come to you.
you touched upon that the losing and the...
I think you need to hold the mic
Hold
a
the
bit
mic
closer.
closer.
Hello?
Yeah, that's better.
So my question is, you touched on the ground saying that the ground rules are changing. So don't you think that's one of the bases that India look forward, that the ground rules needs to change? Because I'll cite two cases. Now with Indian laws, there's something which is prohibited, but there's a proviso which allows that. So don't you think that the ground reasons are one of the reasons that the definitions of Indian are looking to change forward?
Well, when I say the ground rules are changing, I meant the ground rules by which our democracy is conducted. Such as, for example, for 70 years, the unwritten rule was that you don't demonize anyone by the accident of their birth, their caste, their religion, their region, their language, their color. Those are not factors by which people are ever used to be judged from a public platform. Yes, they could get some administrative benefits if they're born in underprivileged minority communities, but there was no, it would have been considered impermissible for political discourse to target a particular religious community, for example. That ground rule is gone. When I grew up in India, things that would not even have been said behind closed doors about certain communities are now being openly said by people from public political platforms, and such people can even be found in the Council of Ministers of the ruling party. That's an example of a ground rule. Or to take a much more trivial political convention, which still speaks volumes. Ever since the parliamentary committees were first established, the tradition has always been that the External Affairs Committee of Parliament that deals with India's foreign policy will always be headed by an opposition member from the leading opposition party. I have been chairman for the last 5 years, but Mr. Vajpayee has been chairman when he was in the opposition, went on to be prime minister. Mr. Gujral was chairman when he was in the opposition. That's the kind of tradition we've had, and it serves two purposes. First, of course, of showing respect for the opposition's views on matters of national interest, but secondly, also conveying to the world that we may have our political differences within the country, but when it comes to foreign policy, we are one, because there's no such thing as a Congress foreign policy or a BJP foreign policy. There's Indian foreign policy, and we stand as one before the world. Our political differences stop at the borders. That's the idea. Well, the BJP has decided that they would want to take on this committee themselves, and so they have replaced me as chairman of that committee with somebody who was Minister of State for Home in the previous BJP government. And it's entirely within their rights to do it because the rule was never written down. It was merely a convention, a tradition. But it was embedded as part of the political culture that the External Affairs Committee would always be chaired by the opposition. Gone. So when I say ground rules, I mean some of these things that made India what it was, made Indian democracy the kind of let's take everybody along kind of system that it always was. That's gone now. You have a ruthless, single-minded, sort of one-party dominant kind of thinking, which is not what we used to have for 70 years of India's independence.
This lady
Hello,
here.
here I am.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
An apolitical question. Like you, I'm raised as a Hindu, grew up, studied in Irish Catholic schools.
Right.
And the similarity ends there, of course. I'm not a Shashi Tharoor.
Now that may or may not be a good thing. It depends on time.
A good thing, not a good thing for me, but I don't know about you.
Thank you.
Anyway, so the question I have was, how did that influence and shape your life? Like at home, we had a particular faith, and in schools, in those days back in India with the Irish nuns, it was chapel was the best place to go, temples are dirty, and you got conditioned like that. And even till date, even though I'm a practicing Hindu now, my first sign in the times of trouble is this. So,
Well, actually, I somehow went to different schools from yours. I mean, the two schools I went to, Campion and St. Xavier's, Campion Bombay and St. Xavier's Calcutta, neither of them had compulsory Catholicism or chapel or Christian lessons for non-Christians. So, in fact, I even had a Protestant kid who joined the non-Catholics in classes that used to be called moral science. And in St. Xavier's in my last years at school were called values of life. Now, there were Christian ethics being taught to us by Jesuit priests, stripped off the Jesus Christ references. Very interesting. So you'd get biblical stories like the Good Samaritan, but they taught you to be a better human being. And so the Jesuits took it upon themselves very seriously to convey a certain ethical system, even without the trappings of religious faith. And so it made us all very respectful of Christianity and Catholicism without in any way there being the slightest attempt to convert us. But intellectually, the Jesuits were very, very interesting, good, qualified teachers. And I remember when I had a brief bout of schoolboy atheism, around age 14, I was the student editor of the school magazine. So I wrote an essay which inevitably wasn't published because everything had been cleared by the priests who were the official editors-in-chief. But I wrote a thing saying God does not exist, and sort of giving all the 14, the arguments that come with your discovery of rationality, and that eventually goes with your realization of the limitations of it. But anyway, so I wrote that, and in response, partly, a young priest in his 20s came to our moral science class and delivered the most brilliant lecture, giving epistemological reasons for the existence of God that left me totally floored, made me think all over again. And not surprisingly, he went on to become one of the great Catholic theologians in India and the head of the Department of Theology in the major seminary that produces Catholic priests. So there was this kind, and the way they taught you everything else. I learned Shakespeare from Jesuit priests who were brilliant in their exposition. Of course, they would Baudelarize bits that they didn't want tender Indian ears to hear. But, and I think many of us, if I'm not mistaken, for what used to be called senior Cambridge for the syllabus, we were actually studying the Baudelarized texts. I mean, literally, I think Shakespeare as rendered by Mr. A.E. Baudelaire. But nonetheless, all the other stuff, the historical allusions, the references, the classical myths, the language, I mean, I don't think I could have learned Shakespeare better than from the Jesuit priests I learned it from. So if you ask me what influence it had, I think it taught me intellectual rigor, made me work hard, opened my mind to things. Both the schools had very good libraries. I kept reading beyond the classroom and outside the classroom, borrowing books from the school libraries. I think I'm very, very proud of the education I had, and as well of the values instilled in me in the course of that education. I mean, there was a thing called the Leadership Training Service in my school, since it actually wasn't really a leadership training service in the egotistical sense of the term. It was actually about imparting social service. It was a way of training you to go out and help the less fortunate. That was the way you went to have to show leadership. So in all these sorts of ways, I would say that it was a wonderful education. I hope it continues to be as good as it is now. It's been 50 years, almost, 48, since I passed out.
No, sorry, there's so many others. No, I just say, all right, okay. Yeah. Okay, one lady here, and then we move to I need to take some from the gentleman as well, otherwise I'll be. So maybe him, and then we'll come back to you. So there's a gentleman there. Sorry, I can't see your faces. I have to stand up,
gender
actually.
by gender or something?
No, just trying not to be accused of doing anything. We've had quite a few
Hi,
women
Dr.
questioners. Yeah.
How do you explain the almost like a global lurch to the right, and what's its motivations? And it's almost like a bloodlust for the minority. So I wanted to know your views.
Well, I've actually written about this in one of my columns for Project Syndicate, which gets syndicated around the world. But in brief, it's that I think we're witnessing a period of two backlashes against globalization, which sometimes converge and overlap and sometimes go on their own rights. There's the backlash, the economic backlash, which essentially is strongest in the Western world, in those countries which have seen particularly blue-collar, but not only blue-collar jobs, migrate to places like China or Mexico if you're American, or Eastern Europe if you're Western European or whatever. So that's one kind of backlash. And the other kind of backlash is what I'd call a cultural backlash, which is simultaneously against the ruthless cosmopolitans, the Goldman Sachs boardroom, Davos man, the people who are, running around writing the rules of globalization, and who don't seem to have any allegiance to any particular place or country. And that cultural backlash is intensified in those Western countries, but not only Western countries, which have had to deal with significant migration or rise in visible minorities. Or in the case of the UK, audible minorities, stepping on a bus and hearing lots and lots of Polish and Slovak seems to do it to you as well for some people. But the result is that these two backlashes together have placed a different premium on nativism, on what people would There's an interesting work by the British philosopher David Goodhart who talks about the distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres. The anywheres are the people, I suppose, like me, who will be comfortable in any business class lounge anywhere in the world and the same sort of hotel anywhere, speaking at the same sorts of conferences in different geographies, and able to relate to people like us everywhere on the planet, versus the somewheres who are anchored in a particular location, proud of their faith, their religion, their ethnicity, their color, their language, their way of life, and who see the anywheres as these impossibly remote characters who are threatening this way of life through the decisions they're making. And I think that's actually a very plausible construction. I remember Theresa May's initially startling and then more understandable comment when she said, if you call yourself a citizen of the world, you haven't understood the first thing about what citizenship is all about. And initially one thinks, what a backward-looking thing to say. But then you understand what she means, that national allegiance is a much stronger motivating factor for many people. Now, I still say two backlashes because they don't always overlap. So people like President Erdogan in Turkey or Prime Minister Modi in India, they're not rejecting Davos man. They want to be Davos man. But in their own countries, they're running a politics of authentic nationalism. So Erdogan is much more Islamist than anyone who's come before him. Modi is pursuing Hindutva and demonizing Muslims. So all of this is going on at a time when the global currents, for perhaps different reasons, because Turkey and India were beneficiaries of globalization, not net losers. But for different reasons, these two backlashes are converging around the globe. Is that a good enough explanation for you?
No, we can't. You can have this later. I've been told to wrap this up now, so maybe one last question. Maybe from the back, or take one right from the back, because I can't even see them. Let's have one from the back. Make it good, it's the last question.
I'll keep it literary, you know what. So just keeping to the theme of the event, which has been your most memorable fictional character, or as you would put it, most magisterial, mellifluously inspiring character?
I would really have to spend too long thinking about that. Don't want to waste your time ruminating aloud. Because, a character really always serves a purpose in fiction. I assume you mean a fictional character, right? Because a character always serves a fictional purpose. In a perverse way, I would probably say Ved Vyas, the Mahabharata, and in my novel, is both narrator and participant in many of the events he describes. And so you've got this peculiar thing of the narrator of the story getting into the action, actually siring a child or two, then become major protagonists of the story, and then retreating to being a narrator. So if I had to pick one, it could probably be Ved Vyas, because of the fact that he is both narrator and character, and a thing I borrowed for the great Indian novel as well, which made, I think, as a literary technique, it works very well 2,000 years on. But it's also, the epic was originally written in verse. It's the world's longest poem. I decided, of course, when I had to write a novel, not a novel in verse, but I would occasionally burst into doggerel, limericks and jokey verse, precisely in order to hark back to the poetic quality of the original. And similarly, Vedavyas is in this politician, in and out of the narrative of the novel, participating in it, doing crucial things, eavesdropping, listening in on conversations, and then going back and being the omniscient narrator. So there's your memorable character, if you want one.
Right. Thanks so much. We've got to wrap this up. Thank you. Big warm applause for Shashi.